22-year-old Marcus Bennett walked into the Cook County Courthouse like he owned the place, a cocky grin plastered across his face as cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. He was there to face charges for a crime that had shocked the entire Chicago community. Yet, he carried himself with the swagger of a celebrity attending a premiere. What Marcus didn't realize was that his arrogance would become the prosecution's most powerful weapon, and the final blow would come from the last person he ever expected. The crime that brought Marcus Bennett to this moment began on a humid August evening in the quiet Lincoln Park neighborhood of Chicago. Sarah Mitchell, a 45-year-old nurse and mother of 3, was returning home from a double shift at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. She had spent 14 hours caring for others, her scrubs still bearing the faint scent of antiseptic, her feet aching as she climbed the steps to her brownstone apartment building. Sarah was known throughout the neighborhood as the woman who would stop to help anyone in need. She organized food drives, volunteered at the local community center, and never missed a chance to check on elderly neighbors. On this particular night, she was looking forward to nothing more than a hot shower and a few quiet moments before her youngest daughter's soccer game the next morning. The attack happened in the building's underground parking garage at 11:23 p.m. Security footage would later show a figure lurking in the shadows, waiting with calculated patience. What followed was not a random mugging or a crime of opportunity, but a targeted assault of shocking brutality. Sarah Mitchell was beaten so severely that she spent 3 weeks in a coma, the same hospital where she had dedicated years of her life, now working desperately to save hers. The first 911 call came from a neighbor who heard screaming through the ventilation system that connected the parking levels. By the time police arrived, Sarah lay unconscious in a pool of blood, her purse and phone untouched beside her, eliminating robbery as a motive. Her car keys were still clutched in her hand, suggesting she never even had a chance to defend herself. The violence was excessive, personal, and utterly senseless. Detective Rachel Torres was the lead investigator assigned to the case. A 15-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department, she had seen her share of violent crimes, but something about this case struck her differently. The victim was a healer, someone who spent her life helping others, and yet someone had tried to destroy her with the level of rage that suggested deep personal hatred. Torres knew immediately that this was not the work of a stranger. The investigation began with the basics. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed everyone in Sarah's building, and pulled security footage from every camera within a 3-block radius. Sarah's family was beside themselves with grief and confusion. Her husband, Thomas, a high school guidance counselor, could think of no one who would want to hurt his wife. Their 3 children, ranging from 12 to 19, were devastated, their mother's hospital room becoming their second home as they waited and prayed.
Sarah's eldest daughter, Emma, a college freshman home for the summer, was particularly affected. She had been the last family member to see her mother before the attack, having shared dinner with her before Sarah left for her evening shift. Emma remembered her mother laughing about a patient who had told terrible jokes all day, so full of life and warmth. The contrast between that memory and the broken woman in the hospital bed was almost too much to bear. The breakthrough came on the 4th day of the investigation. A witness who had been out of town finally returned and reported seeing a young man acting strangely near the building on the night of the attack. The description was vague, but combined with security footage from a nearby convenience store, detectives were able to identify a person of interest. The image showed a tall, athletic young man in designer clothes entering the store at 10:47 p.m., just 36 minutes before the assault. Cross-referencing the image with local databases and social media proved surprisingly easy in the age of digital oversharing. The man was identified as Marcus Bennett, a 22-year-old from an affluent North Shore suburb. What made investigators' blood run cold was the connection they discovered. Marcus was the older brother of Sarah Mitchell's daughter Emma's ex-boyfriend, Tyler Bennett. 6 months earlier, Emma had broken up with Tyler after a brief relationship, citing his controlling behavior and explosive temper. According to Emma's statement, Tyler had not taken the breakup well. He had harassed her with calls and texts, shown up uninvited at her dorm, and made veiled threats. Sarah had stepped in, contacting Tyler's parents and making it clear that if the harassment continued, they would involve the police. The behavior had stopped, but apparently the family's resentment had not. Marcus, the older brother who had always protected Tyler, had decided to exact revenge on the woman he blamed for embarrassing his family. With the suspect identified, Detective Torres and her team moved quickly. They obtained warrants for Marcus's phone records, social media accounts, and eventually his home and vehicle. What they found painted a disturbing picture of escalating obsession and rage. Text messages between Marcus and Tyler showed Marcus referring to Sarah as that interfering witch and promising Tyler that he would handle it. In the days leading up to the attack, Marcus had driven past Sarah's building multiple times, documenting his surveillance and photos stored on his phone. The most damning evidence came from Marcus's car. A forensic examination revealed traces of Sarah's blood on the rubber floor mat of the trunk, along with a tire iron that bore her DNA and Marcus's fingerprints. It was a devastating collection of evidence, each piece a link in an unbreakable chain, connecting Marcus Bennett to the brutal assault that had nearly claimed Sarah Mitchell's life. The arrest took place at the Bennett family's sprawling estate in Winnetka. Marcus was at home, lounging by the pool with friends when a fleet of police vehicles arrived. Officers expected some resistance or at least surprise, but Marcus's reaction was oddly muted. He smirked as Detective Torres read him his rights, making jokes about lawyers and asking if the handcuffs came in a more stylish color. His friends watched in stunned silence as he was led away, his cavalier attitude completely at odds with the severity of the charges he faced.
During the initial interrogation, Marcus's behavior was even more disturbing. He treated the entire process as beneath him, answering questions with sarcastic quips and eye rolls. When detectives presented evidence, he barely glanced at it. His lawyer, a high-priced defense attorney named Richard Hartwell, hired by his wealthy parents, advised him to remain silent, but Marcus couldn't help himself. He wanted to show how clever he was, how untouchable he believed himself to be. At one point, when Detective Torres mentioned Sarah Mitchell's condition and the fact that she had 3 children waiting for her to wake up, Marcus actually laughed. Not a nervous laugh or a laugh of disbelief, but a genuine laugh of amusement, as if the detective had told him a funny story. It was a moment that Torres would later describe as one of the most chilling of her entire career. She had dealt with hardened criminals, gang members, and violent offenders, but she had never encountered someone so young who displayed such a complete absence of human empathy. The case against Marcus Bennett was assigned to Assistant State's Attorney Jennifer Park, a prosecutor known for her methodical approach and her ability to connect with juries on an emotional level. Park had built her career on holding violent offenders accountable, and she saw in Marcus Bennett a particularly dangerous type of criminal. Someone who committed violence not out of desperation or passion, but out of entitlement and contempt for others. Park's first challenge was deciding how to charge Marcus. The attack on Sarah Mitchell was clearly premeditated, evidenced by his surveillance and planning. However, Sarah had survived, which meant murder charges were off the table. Instead, Park pursued charges of attempted murder, aggravated battery, and stalking. The combination of charges, if convicted, could result in decades in prison. But Park knew that with Marcus's wealthy family backing him and his complete lack of remorse, this trial would be an uphill battle. The defense strategy, crafted by Richard Hartwell, was predictably aggressive. Hartwell was one of Chicago's most successful defense attorneys, known for getting wealthy clients out of seemingly impossible situations. His approach was to attack the prosecution's evidence, suggest alternative suspects, and portray Marcus as a young man caught up in circumstances beyond his control. Hartwell planned to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that Marcus had been in the area, but had nothing to do with the attack, and that the real culprit was still at large. In the months leading up to trial, Marcus's behavior became increasingly erratic and concerning. Released on $1 million bond posted by his parents, he seemed to view his legal troubles as a temporary inconvenience rather than a serious threat. He was spotted at clubs and parties, often posting on social media about his exploits. In one particularly tone-deaf Instagram post, he posed with friends under the caption, "Innocent until proven innocent," a grammatical error that nonetheless captured his defiant attitude. The media coverage of the case was intense. Sarah Mitchell's story resonated with the public, a dedicated nurse and mother brutally attacked for no reason other than protecting her daughter. Meanwhile, Marcus Bennett became a symbol of privileged entitlement, a young man who believed his family's money and status placed him above the law. The contrast between the two could not have been starker, and public opinion heavily favored the prosecution.
Sarah Mitchell, miraculously, began to recover. 3 weeks after the attack, she emerged from her coma, though the road to recovery would be long and painful. She had sustained a traumatic brain injury, multiple broken bones, and would require months of physical therapy. Her memory of the attack was fragmented, but she remembered seeing Marcus's face in the parking garage, remembered the first blow, and then nothing until she woke in the hospital, surrounded by her family. Her survival was both a blessing and a complication for the prosecution. As a living victim, Sarah could potentially testify, providing powerful emotional testimony. However, her injuries meant that some of her memories were unclear, which the defense would certainly exploit. Jennifer Park spent hours with Sarah, gently walking her through what she remembered, preparing her for the brutal cross-examination that Richard Hartwell would undoubtedly deliver. The trial began on a cold November morning, the courthouse steps packed with media and protesters. Inside, the courtroom was filled to capacity, with Sarah Mitchell's family on one side and Marcus Bennett's wealthy parents and their entourage on the other. The jury selection had taken 2 weeks, with both sides carefully vetting potential jurors for any biases. The final panel consisted of 8 women and 4 men, a diverse cross-section of Chicago that included teachers, business owners, a retired firefighter, and a social worker. Marcus entered the courtroom each day dressed in expensive suits, his hair perfectly styled, often whispering to his lawyer and occasionally winking at friends in the gallery. His parents sat stoically behind him, their faces carefully neutral, though his mother, Victoria Bennett, often looked troubled by her son's cavalier demeanor. His father, Robert Bennett, a prominent real estate developer, maintained an air of annoyed impatience, as if the trial were keeping him from more important matters. Opening statements set the tone for the battle ahead. Jennifer Park approached the jury with quiet intensity, her voice steady as she outlined the prosecution's case. She spoke of Sarah Mitchell's dedication to helping others, her years of service as a nurse, and the senseless brutality of the attack that had nearly taken her life. Park methodically laid out the evidence, the surveillance, the text messages, the blood in Marcus's car, the tire iron with his fingerprints and Sarah's DNA.
Hartwell suggested that the real attacker was someone else entirely, perhaps someone Sarah had encountered at the hospital, a disgruntled patient or family member.
He argued that the blood evidence could have been transferred innocently, that the tire iron could have been planted, and that the police had focused on Marcus because of his family's wealth and his connection to Sarah's daughter, rather than following the evidence objectively. It was a bold strategy, one that relied on creating just enough doubt in jurors' minds to secure an acquittal. Throughout both opening statements, Marcus maintained his infuriating smirk. When Park described the severity of Sarah's injuries, he shook his head slightly, as if disagreeing with an academic argument rather than hearing about the consequences of brutal violence. When Hartwell suggested alternative suspects, Marcus nodded vigorously, playing the role of the wrongly accused victim. Several jurors noticed his behavior, their expressions hardening as they observed his casual disrespect. The prosecution's case unfolded over 2 weeks, a carefully orchestrated presentation of evidence and testimony. Jennifer Park called Detective Torres to the stand first, allowing her to walk the jury through the investigation step by step. Torres was a compelling witness, professional yet passionate, clearly affected by the case. She described finding Sarah in the parking garage, the extensive injuries, and the methodical process of tracking down her attacker. The medical testimony came next. Sarah's doctors described the extent of her injuries in clinical detail: skull fractures, internal bleeding, broken ribs, and the traumatic brain injury that had put her in a coma. They showed X-rays and CT scans, graphic evidence of the violence she had endured. One neurosurgeon testified that Sarah had been within minutes of death when she arrived at the emergency room, only surviving due to the skill of the trauma team and what he called a miracle. Throughout the medical testimony, Marcus appeared bored. He doodled on a legal pad, checked his watch, and at one point was seen yarning widely. His lawyer elbowed him sharply, but the damage was done. Multiple jurors had witnessed his complete indifference to Sarah's suffering. It was a preview of the self-sabotage that would define his entire trial experience. The prosecution's case unfolded over 2 weeks, a carefully orchestrated presentation of evidence and testimony. Jennifer Park called Detective Torres to the stand first, allowing her to walk the jury through the investigation step by step. Torres was a compelling witness, professional yet passionate, clearly affected by the case. She described finding Sarah in the parking garage, the extensive injuries, and the methodical process of tracking down her attacker.
Tyler Bennett himself was called as a prosecution witness, granted immunity in exchange for his testimony. He appeared nervous and uncomfortable, clearly regretting his involvement in the events that led to Sarah's attack. Tyler testified that Marcus had been furious about the situation, viewing Sarah's intervention as a humiliation of the Bennett family. According to Tyler, Marcus had said multiple times that someone needed to teach that nurse a lesson. Perhaps most damning was the testimony of Marcus's former roommate, Jason Chen. Chen, who had lived with Marcus during the planning phase of the attack, testified that Marcus had become increasingly obsessed with getting revenge. Chen described Marcus's surveillance of Sarah, his research into her schedule, and his chilling statements about what he planned to do. When asked why he hadn't gone to the police, Chen admitted he thought Marcus was just venting and never believed he would actually follow through. The testimony that brought the courtroom to tears came from Sarah Mitchell herself. Still recovering, she walked slowly to the witness stand, leaning on a cane, her movements careful and deliberate. The woman who took the oath was a shadow of the vibrant nurse captured in family photos, her face bearing faint scars, her speech slightly slurred from her injuries, but her spirit was unbroken. Sarah testified about the night of the attack, her voice quiet but steady. She described working a double shift, looking forward to going home to her family. She remembered parking her car and hearing footsteps behind her. When she turned, she saw Marcus Bennett approaching, his face twisted with rage. She remembered asking if she could help him,
the irony of her nursing instinct kicking in even as danger approached. Then she described the first blow, the explosion of pain and darkness. When asked to identify her attacker, Sarah looked directly at Marcus, her gaze unwavering. "That's him," she said, pointing. "That's the man who tried to kill me." For a brief moment, Marcus's smirk faltered, replaced by something darker, annoyance at being directly confronted by his victim. But the smirk quickly returned, his armor of arrogance firmly back in place. Jennifer Park's final question was devastating in its simplicity. "Mrs. Mitchell, what has this attack cost you?" Sarah took a deep breath, tears streaming down her face. "Everything," she whispered. "My health, my independence, my sense of safety. I can't work anymore. I can't do the job I loved, helping people. I have constant pain, memory problems. But worst of all, I see the fear in my children's eyes every day, knowing that someone hurt me because I tried to protect my daughter. That's what he took from me, my family's peace." During cross-examination, Richard Hartwell was surprisingly gentle, recognizing that attacking a sympathetic victim would backfire spectacularly. He focused instead on her memory, suggesting that her recollection of events might be unreliable due to her head injury. Sarah remained firm. She remembered Marcus's face, remembered the attack, and no amount of legal maneuvering would change that truth. With the prosecution's case concluded, the burden shifted to the defense. Richard Hartwell's strategy was to create doubt without directly blaming Sarah. He called his own forensic experts who testified that the evidence could have been contaminated, that DNA transfer could occur innocently, and that cell phone data was not precise enough to definitively place Marcus at the exact location of the attack. The defense also called character witnesses, friends and family members who testified that Marcus was a good kid who had never been in serious trouble before. They painted a picture of a young man from a good family, someone who was perhaps irresponsible and immature, but certainly not capable of attempted murder. His father, Robert Bennett, testified about the family's standing in the community, as if wealth and reputation were evidence of innocence. Marcus's mother, Victoria Bennett, was scheduled to be the defense's star witness. The plan was for her to provide emotional testimony about her son's character, to humanize him in the eyes of the jury. Richard Hartwell had spent hours coaching her, crafting a narrative of a loving mother standing by her accused son. But as the trial progressed and Victoria watched her son's behavior in court, something inside her began to crack. During recesses, Victoria observed Marcus joking with friends, showing no concern for Sarah Mitchell or remorse for his actions. She heard him referred to the trial as boring and complain about having to wear suits every day. She watched him smirk during Sarah's testimony, seemingly amused by the pain he had caused. For years, Victoria had made excuses for Marcus's behavior, chalked up his cruelty to youthful indiscretion, convinced herself that he would mature and change. But sitting in that courtroom, watching him mock the justice system and his victim, she finally saw the truth. The night before she was scheduled to testify, Victoria had a breakdown. She called Richard Hartwell and told him she couldn't do it, couldn't stand up and lie about who her son really was. Hartwell, panicking, tried to convince her that she had to testify, that the defense strategy depended on her humanizing Marcus. But Victoria was done protecting him. She had spent 2 decades enabling a monster, and she was finally ready to face that truth. The next morning, when Victoria Bennett's name was called, she stood and walked to the witness stand with the determined gait of a woman who had made a difficult decision.
Richard Hartwell began his direct examination with gentle questions about Marcus's childhood, trying to establish him as a normal, loving child. Victoria answered briefly, her responses clipped and devoid of the warmth Hartwell had coached her to display. Then, unexpectedly, Victoria stopped responding to Hartwell's scripted questions. She turned to the jury directly and said, "I can't do this. I can't stand here and lie about who my son is." The courtroom fell silent. Hartwell's face went pale. Marcus, for the first time in the entire trial, looked genuinely concerned.
Judge Margaret Reynolds, presiding over the trial, leaned forward. "Mrs. Bennett, do you wish to continue your testimony?" Victoria nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, but I need to tell the truth, not the story I was told to tell." What followed was a devastation of the defense's case. Victoria Bennett, tears streaming down her face, told the jury about the real Marcus. She described a child who tortured animals, who bullied other children, who showed no empathy for anyone. She admitted that she and her husband had used their wealth and influence to cover up his behavior for years, paying off victims, bribing school officials, making problems disappear with money. She testified about Marcus's escalating violence, incidents that had been swept under the rug. She described his obsession with revenge against anyone who crossed him or his family. She admitted that when Tyler told them about Emma breaking up with him, Marcus had become enraged, viewing it as a personal insult to the Bennett name. Victoria had dismissed his anger as temporary, never imagining he would actually act on his threats. "I created this," Victoria said, her voice breaking. "I raised him to believe he was above consequences, that our money and status meant he could do whatever he wanted. Every time he hurt someone, I made excuses. Every time he showed cruelty, I called it a phase. I taught him that other people didn't matter, that his feelings and desires were all that mattered, and now a good woman almost died because I was too afraid to admit what my son really was." She looked directly at Sarah Mitchell, who sat in the gallery, tears streaming down her own face. "I am so sorry," Victoria whispered. "I know it doesn't change anything, but I am so deeply sorry for what he did to you, for what I allowed him to become." The courtroom was utterly silent, except for the sound of crying. Jennifer Park stood, her face a mixture of shock and vindication. Even Judge Reynolds appeared moved, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Richard Hartwell sat at the defense table, his career's biggest case evaporating before his eyes. Marcus's reaction was volcanic. He shot to his feet, his chair clattering backward. "You're lying," he screamed at his mother. "You're a pathetic, weak woman. I didn't do anything wrong." Bailiffs moved quickly to restrain him as he continued to rage, his carefully maintained facade completely shattered. The jury watched in horror as the polite, smirking defendant transformed into something ugly and violent, his true nature finally on full display. Judge Reynolds slammed her gavel repeatedly, ordering Marcus to be removed from the courtroom. As bailiffs dragged him out, he continued screaming obscenities at his mother, at the judge, at the jury. His outburst, captured by the court reporter and witnessed by everyone present, was the final nail in his legal coffin. He had shown the jury exactly who he was, a violent, entitled man-child, incapable of controlling his rage when things didn't go his way. The trial concluded quickly after that. Richard Hartwell, recognizing that his case was destroyed, rested without calling any further witnesses. Closing arguments were almost anticlimactic. Jennifer Park simply reminded the jury of the evidence, and Victoria Bennett's testimony, concluding with, "She showed you who he is. His own mother showed you who he is. Now, you must hold him accountable."
Hartwell's closing argument was brief and defeated. He made a half-hearted attempt to argue reasonable doubt, but even he seemed to recognize the futility. Marcus was not allowed back in the courtroom for closing arguments, deemed too disruptive by the judge. He watched from a holding cell on a video monitor, his rage having finally burned out, leaving only sullen silence. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous on all counts. Guilty of attempted murder, guilty of aggravated battery, guilty of stalking. Sarah Mitchell collapsed in her husband's arms, sobbing with relief. Victoria Bennett sat alone on the defense side of the courtroom, her face a mask of sorrow and something that looked like relief. She had finally told the truth, had finally stopped protecting the monster she had created. Sentencing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. The courtroom was once again packed, the media frenzy reaching its peak. Marcus was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands shackled. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed fear. Reality had finally penetrated his delusion of invincibility. Judge Reynolds, before announcing the sentence, addressed the court. She spoke of the importance of accountability, of the need for justice not just for victims, but for society as a whole. She talked about privilege and entitlement, about how wealth should never be a shield against consequences. Then she turned her attention to Marcus. "Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice cold and clear, "throughout this trial you have shown nothing but contempt. Contempt for this court, contempt for the jury, contempt for your victim, and contempt for the very concept of justice. You believed your family's money and status made you untouchable. You believed you could attack an innocent woman and face no consequences. You were wrong." Judge Reynolds sentenced Marcus to 40 years in prison, the maximum allowed under state law. He would be eligible for parole after serving 32 years, by which time he would be in his 50s. The courtroom erupted in applause, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. But the message was clear. Justice had been served. As Marcus was led from the courtroom for the final time, he looked back at his mother one last time. Victoria met his gaze, her face wet with tears, but her expression resolute. She had done the right thing, even if it meant losing her son. She had finally chosen truth and justice over blind maternal loyalty. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Sarah Mitchell addressed the media, her family surrounding her. "This was never about revenge," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "It was about accountability. It was about making sure that wealth and privilege don't place anyone above the law. I hope Marcus uses his time in prison to develop the empathy and conscience he so clearly lacks. And I hope his case serves as a warning to others who think they can hurt people without consequences." Victoria Bennett released a statement through her attorney, announcing that she was divorcing her husband Robert, who had supported Marcus's defense to the end, still refusing to believe his son was guilty. She also announced the creation of a foundation in Sarah Mitchell's name, dedicated to supporting victims of violent crime and their families. It was a small gesture in the face of enormous harm, but it was a start.
The case of Marcus Bennett became a landmark in discussions about privilege, accountability, and the justice system. His trial was studied in law schools as an example of how a defendant's demeanor can impact jury perception, and how even the strongest defense can crumble when confronted with truth. But more than that, it became a story about a mother who finally found the courage to stop protecting her child and start protecting the truth. Sarah Mitchell continued her long recovery, eventually able to return to work part-time at the hospital, though never at the level she had before the attack. Her children grew up with the knowledge that justice had been served, that the man who hurt her mother would spend decades paying for his crime. The scars, both physical and emotional, would never fully heal, but the Mitchell family moved forward, their faith in the justice system restored. Marcus Bennett serves his sentence at Stateville Correctional Center, a maximum security prison outside Chicago. Reports from inside indicate that prison has been a harsh education for a young man who had never faced real consequences before. Without his family's wealth to protect him, without his mother's excuses, he is just another inmate serving time for a violent crime. Whether he has truly changed, whether he has developed the capacity for remorse and empathy he so clearly lacked, remains to be seen. Victoria Bennett never visited her son in prison. She explained in a later interview that her decision to testify against him was not about abandoning her child, but about finally holding him accountable for his actions, something she admitted she should have done years earlier. "I loved him," she said, "but love without boundaries isn't love. It's enablement. And my enablement almost cost an innocent woman her life." The story of Marcus Bennett serves as a powerful reminder that justice, while sometimes slow and imperfect, can ultimately prevail. It demonstrates that arrogance and entitlement, no matter how deeply ingrained, cannot withstand the weight of truth and accountability. And perhaps most importantly, it shows that courage can come from unexpected places, even from a mother willing to sacrifice everything to finally do what is right. The courtroom that day saw not just the conviction of a violent criminal, but the redemption of a woman who had spent 22 years making excuses for inexcusable behavior. Victoria Bennett's testimony was not just evidence, it was a confession, an apology, and a promise to do better. In facing the truth about her son, she found her own path to redemption, proving that it's never too late to choose justice over comfort, truth over lies, and accountability over blind loyalty. And in the end, Marcus Bennett's smirk was replaced by the stark reality of prison bars, his arrogance stripped away by the one force he never thought would turn against him, a mother who finally loved her child enough to stop protecting him from the consequences of his actions.